So today I want to talk to you about the importance of cultivating a conducive environment for women to enter the field of research, to enable them to secure their voices in policy debates and policy research.
Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and I have with me Mariam Safi, who is an Afghan-Canadian who has been working in Afghanistan or was working in Afghanistan for over 16 years. She was working in the area of policy and development. She has contributed a lot to Afghanistan, and I'm sure she must be devastated that she had to abandon her work and leave Afghanistan in 2021 when the United States essentially withdrew unceremoniously from Afghanistan and in such a haphazard and terrible fashion, which not only hurt America's image abroad, but essentially did a lot of damage to all of those people in Afghanistan who have worked very closely with the United States and the international community in trying to transform Afghanistan into a more developed society where women and people of different ethnicities and different sects have equal opportunity and equal rights. So welcome, Mariam Safi, to Khanversations.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
So Mariam Safi is currently a fellow at SOAS and ODI, and she is also the director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies. And she's right now based in London, and she's talking to me from London. And before I ask her my first question, please do the needful, that is subscribe to Khanversations, ring the bell icon, like the video, and remember to share it with your friends and social network because this is going to be an important conversation. So Mariam, what has happened to Afghanistan since the West and the United States left? I can see from the indicators that are being shared by World Bank and others that the economy has shrunk by 20 to 30%. Unemployment is rampant. There is a humanitarian crisis. So can you bring us up to date on what is the situation of Afghanistan at the moment?
The situation in the country since the takeover, the military takeover by the Taliban, has been one that can be best described as catastrophic. You've just pointed out to the economy. The economy has certainly shrunk, though the Taliban have been stating that they've done a very good job in collection of revenue. That they've increased the GDP to the point where the country will not be very dependent on aid in the near future. Yet when we at DROPS have conduct our surveys across the country with 2,000, 2,500 respondents on a regular basis, we find that there has been no improvement in access to public services. We particularly speak with women, and just this past December, we asked them in terms of delivery of public services because we wanted to know where this revenue was going. And the majority of women told us that women's access to public services has not changed. So that's not an area where it's going. So in terms of access to education, access to healthcare, government services, for example, has not seen an improvement. On the security situation, the United Nations Special Representative for Afghanistan has repeatedly said this, even in her very recent statement, that they are very much concerned about the increasing insecurity in the country and the presence of ISIS now in various parts of the country, whereas in the past it was predominantly limited to the northeast, central north. Now we're starting to see it all over, presence all over the country, and the Taliban do not seem to have a control over or preventing the further spread of ISKP in the country. So that is another a very serious situation. We also conducted a survey on the matter of security in July. And we found from our respondents that security not only has has worsened, but different forms of security have actually come to being and have become worse. So petty theft, criminal activity, robberies, that type of activity has increased in areas that used to see more more security related threats in terms of terrorist attacks, etc. And then in provinces where security threats by terrorist related activity wasn't a matter, and it was more petty crime and theft, that has gradually decreased. Terrorist activity has increased. So we're starting to see this weird shift in different provinces in the country. The drug trade in Afghanistan is not one that has been abolished, even though the Taliban had abolished it in the 90s. They have not been able to do so now. I just saw a recent report today that there was a very large consignment of drugs caught at the border between Afghanistan and I think it was Uzbekistan. But so we're also seeing that happen. So the situation in the country prior to the fall wasn't good. It's not that Afghanistan was stable and that Afghanistan's pillars of democracy were stable, or that we were heading towards a sustainable path. So the situation prior wasn't all that very conducive to what we had hoped, which was a stronger democracy by the time the international community would leave. Having said that, where we are now is the complete reversal of all human rights, including women's rights on the ground. We have seen a complete upheaval of the judicial system, not only when it comes to judicial services and access for women, but generally. What we are seeing in the country is that the Taliban have not been able to uphold their call for amnesty. Extrajudicial killings is rampant, especially of former Afghan National Security and Defense Forces, and floggings, arbitrary arrests, clamping down on almost all civil society organizations in the country, shutting down women's-based organizations, largely curbing the presence of media and freedom of expression to a point where it is not existing. It's non-existent in the country. So taking all of that into consideration, Afghanistan finds itself in a situation that is very difficult to envision paths to be able to come out of this and bring with us what we had achieved in the last 20 years and see what we can save and what we cannot save. So the Taliban are kind of hell-bent on destroying all of those pillars and all of those gains in the last 20 years.
What are they providing? So for example, those people who in Kabul and at least in the urban areas who enjoyed some of the benefits that were provided by this attempt to establish some form of democracy. Plus, there was also the foreign presence also contributed to the growth of the economy, isn't it? A lot of money was coming in, foreign aid was coming in, development aid was coming in. The very presence of so many foreign soldiers also essentially meant that there was some additional economic activity taking place. So people who had got used to this higher level of income and freedom in the society to do business, to do whatever they wanted. So what is the Taliban providing? Like those who support the Taliban, the thousands of people who are with the Taliban, what are they getting from the governance of the Taliban? Like what have they achieved in more than a year and a half that Taliban have been in charge now?
I mean, they have not yet been able to forge a government. This is not a government. It is they are what the UN calls a de facto authority that is that does not have any legitimacy from the people, has not been able to set out a political path that would be accepted by the population or inclusive of the population. As you know, Dr. Khan, Afghanistan is a country comprised of different ethnic groups, linguistic groups, religious groups, and there is many stratas of Afghan society, and creating any political path forward that could get you a credible and legitimate government, you would need to bring all of these individuals together, including women, and identify what that long-term vision is, and to have a consensus around that vision, or some degree of consensus around that vision, and then move ahead. So the Taliban did say that they were going to, when they first came in August of 2021, that they were going to take a inclusive approach in identifying a political path forward that would be acceptable to all Afghans. This is one of the very first things they said when they took over the palace, and they made a press statement. But that hasn't yet happened. So there is no credible government in the country. Having said that, the class, that growing middle class in Afghanistan, was one largely based in urban areas, so more city centers. So you're talking about city centers in Kabul, city centers in Herat and Mazar, Jalalabad, etc. But in the city centers, now this group has, to a certain extent, I don't have the figures, I don't know if figures are available for it, were either evacuated or have left the country or are in the process of leaving the country, especially if they worked for the former government, they work for the embassies, they work for international INGOs or local NGOs. I mean, those were the areas, it was that presence of that community of individuals or groups that it had enabled this middle class to grow in Afghanistan. And so with them having left, these individuals have either left, or I'm positive would either or be in the process of leaving, because there is nothing in the country to be able to substitute what they were earning or the lifestyle that they once had. And if there are some individuals, and there are individuals that have gone back to work for the government, even under the de facto authorities, so within the existing structures of ministries and whatnot. So there is also a group that has gone back and worked for the government. And so far, we hear that the Taliban are able to pay for the salaries of civil servants. And the palace was, or should I say, the Afghan government was the largest source of employment for Afghans, especially in Kabul and the surrounding areas. And so I do not know if they've been able to employ the same number of civil servants back, but they have tried to be able to tap into that existing knowledge to be able to ensure some degree of continuity. Aside from that, the Taliban have been working with China. They have been working with Pakistan. They have been working with Iran, and trying to see if they can also ensure some continuity in terms of the regional economic initiatives that were there. So these include highways and railway lines, and so a lot of trade and transit initiatives that were incomplete and required more time for their completion, and also in terms of the mining sector, as well as they've been attempting, because now the idea is that there is security in Afghanistan, so you can attract foreign investment, which was starting to become very difficult in the latter years for the Republic. And so I see that there's a lot of economic activity regionally, particularly with China's involvement in Afghanistan. How would that turn out at the end of the day, what its outcomes would be? I don't think that it would be very positive, just because there is no measures for accountability or transparency. So we really don't know exactly what these economic interests of of regional countries are that are being facilitated by the Taliban inside the country at the moment. So there is no transparency around them. And
how do these governments feel safe investing money? I mean, one of the deals that the Chinese made was worth $150 million, right? A mining project. So if China is going to invest so much money and there is no transparency, no accountability, there are no courts or even banks, right? So how is this, like, how is the normal process of government to government exchanges and interactions taking place, especially since Afghanistan is also not recognized, the Taliban government is not even recognized by anybody in the world?
Well, there's a few things. One, I don't think that the Chinese really care about transparency or accountability. In fact, lack of transparency and accountability is maybe a preferable environment for them to work in. So I think that in the past, during the Republic, the Chinese were very weary of any type of involvement beyond economic involvement in Afghanistan. And that was because of the NATO presence and because of the US presence. When NATO left, it almost seemed like when the US and NATO left, it almost seemed like Afghanistan was being handed over to the region. The biggest players in the region being China and Russia, China started to almost immediately step in. And very interestingly, not only to continue their economic policies, but also we started to see them in this climate take a bit of a more of a political role as well. So with China's investments in particular during the Republic, China, through its One Belt, One Road initiative, did have a few initiatives in Afghanistan, but they were nothing significant, nothing like CPAC, for example, in Pakistan. So it was just fiber optics. So it was fiber optics, there was an air corridor, for instance, and a few regional railway initiatives that they were part of. But now what I'm seeing happening is that those initiatives are starting to pick up pace, and my forecast is that they're going to pick up a lot of speed in the immediate future, because the Taliban, who were a security issue, that's why all of these initiatives took so long during the Republic to take off and build and whatnot. Security was always mentioned as being one of the most significant hurdles. So you don't have the issue of security anymore, and you have the Taliban ensuring security for where these projects are taking place, and with lack of any oversight and any rules or a parliament that can hold you accountable, I think it's given a lot of free space for both some of the regional actors and also for the Taliban to be able to implement whatever initiatives they deem most economically beneficial for them right now, with disregard for the local communities that are going to be affected, where these initiatives are going to take place, with no regard for the environmental ramifications of where these initiatives will be implemented, or any of the others. And so I think that's one key aspect of it, that would create a conducive environment for China to be able to work. And then also, of course, we also see China's influence at the UN Security Council, and its positions are actually they've been very clear vis-a-vis the status of the country in terms of issues regarding recognition. China and Russia have long pushed at the UN Security Council that steps be taken for more significant engagement and dialogue with the Taliban that could lead to recognition, because their argument is that if you don't recognize them, how can you broaden your engagement beyond a UN mandate, a UNAMA mandate, for instance. They felt that the UNAMA mandate, which had a political component and a humanitarian component, that the political component was not needed and it shouldn't be there, and that it should solely be a humanitarian effort, and that's it. So their positions are clear on that stance, but also you have over 10 countries that have recognized the diplomats that the de facto authorities have introduced to take over the Afghan embassies.
Yeah, they
So in
took
terms of
over
wording,
13 embassies, yeah.
yeah, so in terms of wording and semantics, but that's recognition in so many ways. And Pakistan's a part of that, China's a part of that, Central Asian countries, Iran just did, Turkey just did. So,
but the thing is that some of the demands that the international community is making, and the promises that Afghanistan made even before the US withdrawal was, inclusive government with all the ethnic groups represented, and that they would fight the terrorist groups, and then also they would also respect the rights of especially women's rights. So on the first two issues, ISIS has definitely become stronger in the past 1 year. We can see it in the number of attacks that it has successfully perpetrated, even against Chinese interests, are growing in number, and there is no change in government or inclusivity from Afghanistan. So the international community, if it were to engage and recognize the Taliban, then it is rewarding bad behavior, isn't it? And if it doesn't engage and doesn't recognize them, then there is a possibility that that things will continue to deteriorate. So what is the international community to do?
that's the $1 million question, Dr. Khan. What should the international community do? And right now, where the international community finds themselves, particularly after the recent edict by the Taliban banning women from working with UN agencies. Now, this was a clear violation of the UN Charter and UN principles across the board. So when this happened, the UN came out very, very strongly in a statement, and said that it was considering leaving if the Taliban did not reverse this ban, because when it comes to humanitarian aid, the principles of humanitarian aid and respect for neutrality is something that is violated when you don't allow women to be able to be part of the delivery of aid to other women. Now, that's going to then further hamper the ability of women, especially female-headed households, from gaining access to much-needed aid. So now that it violates humanitarian aid principles, it violates the rest of the UN's UNAMA's mandate in Afghanistan. This question has come up, and the state members in the international community at large is thinking about, okay, what should we do? Should we stay in Afghanistan? But if we stay with these edicts in place, then it means that we accept that our principles and values even our humanitarian principles are being violated, yet we will remain in the country, which is quite a difficult situation for the international community to do. And I don't think that they would do that. But on the other hand, leaving and disengaging from the country and from the Taliban may not produce a different solution, because the Taliban have often said that if the international community takes away the humanitarian aid in the country, that they have regional partners that would be able to provide that, to fill in that gap. So while sort of these questions were floating around just even now and a couple of weeks ago, we saw the UN take a very interesting, yet at the same time concerning step in holding a conference in Doha to bring together the special envoys. And I think it was just last week where they had this event. And And the idea behind the event, which came to a surprise to a lot of us, was that we would gather the special envoys and discuss how we can identify common incentives, common approaches to providing incentives for the Taliban to change or reverse their restrictions in the short term, in the immediate, medium, and long term. So that was one of the agenda points that the special envoys discussed in those 2 days. And I think the reason why that was being discussed was that one of the factors that has hindered the international community's ability to use its leverage onto the Taliban to pressure them to respect to respect the state's commitments to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other commitments to the UN, has been this lack of a common set of values by members of the international community, and then following that, a common approach to then try to achieve those values in their discussions with the Taliban. So the international community has not been on the same page. There's and the war in Ukraine coming at the time that it had really further disintegrated even the possibilities for talking between state members to try to see if there are any common values that they could approach. And I think this is one of the things that the Doha conference wanted to do. I don't think it has yet been able to do that. It's we cannot expect a 2-day conference to result in that type of in those types of decisions, but I think that will be an ongoing scenario. So generally, I think that the lack of common approach by the international community, identifying that common approach, would lead to strengthening the international community's leverage that then could be used on the Taliban, that could be used to convince them to change these policies. I personally am of the thought that engagement, talking, is something that should continue. You should talk. But sometimes I feel that the international community shifts or plays with their words. So you're talking about talking, and then you're talking about engagement. But that engagement, you're denoting it as steps to recognition. So I find the way these words are being used a little bit difficult and problematic. But there's no harm in talking, and the door to talking should continue to remain open.
Can you tell us more about the Afghan funds that the United States has frozen, the so-called $7 billion assets of Afghanistan? And then there was discussion that half of it would be transferred to some European country, especially Switzerland, and then the Afghans would have limited access to half the amount in order that they be able to use it for humanitarian purposes. Can you shed some light on what's going on with it and what has happened to it? And where did the money originally come from, and why is the U.S. holding on to half of it?
Well, when we found out that the U.S. was holding on to these reserves, I mean, a few weeks after that, I was briefing the UN Security Council. And I said very clearly at that briefing that withholding the full amount was nothing short of theft. And that's exactly what it is. And agreeing to release half of it while keeping the other half for reasons that the U.S. believes is justifiable is something that many Afghans don't feel. It is, this money belongs to the people of Afghanistan and should be returned to the people. Now, in the process of returning these funds, we have to ensure that a few things are in place. The Afghanistan Central Bank, the head of the central bank, is, when the Taliban took over, they appointed a Taliban figure as that head. That head has to be a neutral figure. So in the past, you had a neutral figure as the head of the central bank, and then you had a committee of advisors, technical advisors, that would also be there. And then you had certain accountability measures in place as well. So what happened was a certain segment of Afghans, I myself included, was saying that the money should be transferred to Afghanistan, to the central bank, but we have to make sure that the head of the central bank is changed and that a neutral figure is placed there, and that technical advisory group that used to be there in the past is brought back, and that there are various samples of different transfer or accountability mechanisms that can be put in place to make sure that the funds that do go back are funds that are not going to be misused and are not going to go to for other means, particularly the security sector. So that was the idea and the notion. I'm not quite sure how far they have come, the international community, and making sure that those steps are there. I know that work is progressing on it, but I don't know where they are on that as of yet. But if you look at the Afghan economy, despite the utter shambles it's in, the Taliban have still been able to make sure that the Afghani, the currency, doesn't, completely collapse. And if you see it next to the dollar, it has certainly devalued, but not at the rate that everybody was fearing. Now, that's because there's still money flowing into the country. So the Taliban are receiving funds on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, from other actors, from other regional actors, members of the international community. So that has prevented that complete, utter collapse. So I would say that I don't know beyond this how far they've come along, but that if we don't have those transparency mechanisms in place, sending the money to Afghanistan would be there's no saying if that is going to actually be used for the purposes of continuing to stimulate the economy, or whether it will be spent in other areas.
One of the things that I noticed that some countries continue to engage in, and their embassies are partially operating in Kabul. And one such country is India, obviously. And India is now training Taliban diplomats, and they have had limited engagement with the Taliban. And India and Iran had a recent meeting in which the national security advisors of both the countries met. All of this happened in, this week, the trilateral in Pakistan, the UN event in Doha. And India also made this call for inclusive government. But the thing is that what are these countries doing if they are engaged so much as to train the Taliban and etc.? Why won't they recognize the country or recognize the government as government, because they are actually dealing with the government? And what is their reason for not? Is it fear that the US will be upset or the West will, be unhappy? Or is there some purpose for which, say, countries from OIC countries are not recognizing the Taliban government?
Well, I think, Dr. Khan, your guess would be as good as mine in this regards, but I would just say that the hypocrisy is mind-baffling. It's and this hypocrisy goes from the UN Security Council to all of the different regional forums that are there, to how the bilateral relations of these state actors work and whatnot. And so it is very, when the UN as a whole, when the UN as a whole is not geared up to recognize the Taliban because of the amount of pressure that has come from some other countries. You've got a lot more countries nowadays that have feminist foreign policies, feminist development policies, and so they're all members of some of them are members of the Security Council. and evidently the UN General Assembly. So you have that group of actors. Then you have a group of actors who tend to benefit a lot more in remaining in the gray area to see where everything goes at the end of the day. And so when it comes to, let's say, China or Pakistan or Russia, granting the Taliban access to the embassies, recognizing the credentials of their diplomats is almost partial recognition, as far as I'm concerned. So in that regards, you have that being done, but not fully recognizing the Taliban gives the states a lot of room to maneuver at the UN Security Council and General Assembly and other forums on other matters. So Afghanistan is like a pawn. It always has been a pawn in the game between powerful countries, both globally and in our region, and it continues to be so. And a lot of these countries are very hypocritical. With India in particular, I have to say that India's role, its action has been quite disappointing since the takeover. I do see that for India, as all countries, national security is going to be a key priority, and India is certainly in a place where it has to maintain a certain degree of stability in its engagement with Pakistan, with China, and with Russia in particular. And when they have Afghanistan, a country where the involvement of China has grown, involvement of Russia has grown, Pakistan, of course, has grown, India is afraid to be singled out. So India needs to take an approach that can show a bit of compromise and appeasement in terms of how I see it. And so on the one hand, I hear their ambassador at the UN talking about inclusive governments and respect for women's rights and all of this. And on the other hand, you are training, Taliban,
the diplomats,
de facto government, actors. And so when you do that, you're contradicting your values. We always used to refer to India, or I used to refer to India as the largest democracy, and that's the largest democracy in the world. But the values it upholds for its people, which I thought would continue for the people of Afghanistan, did not after the takeover. After the takeover, India tried to find a scenario where it could maintain its stability, its sense of security. And if that came at the cost and expense of the people of Afghanistan, then so be it. But that's the hypocrisy of international relations.
The challenge for India really is the fact that India, when the international community was there, did invest, it built a parliament and it built some roads, etc. in Afghanistan. But it's also worried that in the absence of a proper government in Afghanistan, there could be groups from essentially Kashmir-related terrorist groups, which used to operate out of Pakistan, which will now could operate out of Afghanistan. So essentially, from a purely national security perspective, I don't think any of not only just India, but all the SCO members, all the Central Asian countries which border Afghanistan, they're all concerned about this whole idea. So, for example, day before yesterday, when Chinese foreign minister was talking about governability inside Afghanistan, they clearly raised the issue of ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement's presence in Afghanistan. So most of these countries are worried that Taliban will will once again provide safe haven for terrorist groups inside their country. And India is also, I think, primarily worried about the fact that if those groups continue to engage, they also give Pakistan a deniability. So Pakistan can say, oh, it's not coming from us, it's coming from Afghanistan. So that is, I think, the primary concern which is driving India's policy. My fear is that in the long run, if the Taliban were not moderate their policies, then they could become like North Korea, a pariah state. No one recognizes, nobody engages, and the only time they get attention is when they do something negative. In the case of North Korea, when they develop nuclear weapons and missiles, and in the case of Afghanistan, it could be when terrorist groups from inside Afghanistan attack countries outside. So that is my biggest fear, that Afghanistan could completely become another pariah state.
If the Taliban are not able to maintain security and curb the growing threat of international and regional terrorist organizations from setting up shop in the country, and if any of those actors launch attacks outside of Afghanistan, then the threat of Afghanistan becoming a pariah state is there. But if the Taliban are able to curb the security and not allow Afghanistan to be used as a launching pad against other countries outside, then they will not become a pariah state, even if they do not reverse their bans against women and girls in the country, even if they do not uphold their commitments to inclusive governance, and even if they don't uphold the state itself, its commitments to various international commitments that the state is a signatory to, it won't be considered a pariah. And that's where we have a problem. That's where the problem for me comes, where you have a authority in the country that is governing illegitimately, and is not able to meet the needs of its own population and asks for humanitarian aid, yet says that it's got revenue that can allow it to become aid independent. So you've got an authority that doesn't care about its citizens, and this type of authority will, I feel, the way I see things moving in the international community, potentially being recognized down the road. Because you see, Dr. Khan, we need to watch these meetings that are taking place with the special envoys very carefully, because if these actors do come together and are able to identify common principles upon which they can then incentivize the Taliban to change their ways, those common principles could be the most common denominator, and that could be the most lowest denominator. Mm-hmm. And the values that we're looking at are going to be which values? It's the values of women's rights and human rights in the country. Those are the values. That's what the international community cannot agree on. And so if that ends up being if they end up choosing the lowest denominator and then upholding that as their value, and then developing their approaches to the Taliban and their engagement with the Taliban on those, and they're going to be very low-hanging fruit that the Taliban can easily achieve, they'll get recognition. And what I see is happening right now is that the international community is very steadily, calculatively moving towards that direction, because they don't want another pariah state on their hands, truth be told. So they don't want that. And so it's not going to, and they're frustrated with Afghanistan. They're tired from Afghanistan, and they've got too many fires to put out elsewhere. And so I think that's where we're heading towards. And that should be very alarming and very concerning, because in the last two years, we see the international community steadily moving towards that, though they're saying different things, though they're talking about the respect for these values, and that recognition is off the table unless A, B, or C happen. But that's not what I see in actions. So we should watch this very carefully and how it develops.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. You can see more and more countries are talking about it. This first 10 days of May, first 9 days of May itself, we saw three major events with engaging or indirectly talking about Afghanistan. And then on SCO agenda, Afghanistan was one of the most prominent. And then even in 2022, there were several conferences hosted by China as well as India around security. I think that the driving force at the moment for countries is security. And so they want to have some kind of engagement. They do want to see a stable and strong government in Afghanistan, which will do the job of maintaining security inside Afghanistan and sealing its borders from potential threats to its neighbors. So Mariam Safi, thank you very much for this wonderful engagement and discussion. And we will continue to keep an eye on Afghanistan. I'll come back to you in a few more months to talk again about if there's any progress or any deterioration, unfortunately. And I wish you all the best for your research projects in London.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, viewers. And I hope you found this conversation interesting. So please subscribe to Khanversations, ring the bell icon, like the video, and share it with your friends and colleagues. And thank you for watching Khanversations. This is Muqtedar Khan.